Hi, this is Ed Fredkin, and I'm going to talk to you about reversible computing. It's a very interesting question that was around for a long time in the computer field. Can computers run backwards, be reversed? And the answer is superficially, it's no. A regular computer, can't run backwards, but it's possible to design a computer that can run backwards, and it would run forwards and backwards. Okay, so and there was a question whether you could do that even, and that's what I worked on a long time ago. Okay, I was at BBN around the late 1950s, and John McCarthy and Marvin Minsky were there also. I had a budget to hire people, and I hired both of them because they were my pals, sort of, and they taught me many things, each of them. I was uneducated, and they were educated guys. Okay, so one day I asked them about the possibility of reversible computing, and they both assured me that it's not possible. When I asked why, I was told there was a proof that you could not do reversible computing, and what they told me was that it was too complicated for me to understand, which is a good thing in a sense, because if I had understood that, I wouldn't have tried to make it, and I wouldn't have done it, but I did. And I never understood why it was, why they thought it was too impossible to do reversible computing, but I proved that it was possible because I thought of ways to make circuits that could compute the inputs of digital logic if you had the outputs. So at the time, what I thought I was doing was solving a philosophical problem. Could a complicated computer run backwards? And the world of computer logic always had elements that had a number of inputs and one output. So if you take the NAND gate, which is universally, it's the not and of two inputs. And universal means you could build any other circuit out of it. Okay, early on, no one thought about reversible computing because the computers always had circuits with the number of inputs to every component being greater than the outputs. So if I have two wires coming into a gate and one coming out, which is AND or NAND, which is not AND, just the opposite of AND, this is two going into one. So from one output, you can't tell what the two were. So in people's minds, since any computer could be built out of these components, they didn't think that a reversible computer could work. And I felt differently, but I was the only one who felt differently. So I pushed on reversible computing for interesting reasons. An ordinary computer is always based on circuits where two inputs come into the circuit and one input comes out. Okay? The AND circuit, the NAND circuit. These are all 2-input circuits that have 1 output. And you could build a computer out of them. Okay. Well, I realized if it's going to be reversible, the number of inputs and outputs has to be the same because, you know, if you have 4 different possible states from 2 inputs, you can't have 1 output that you, in other words, if it's an AND gate, if the output is a 1, you know that both inputs were 1. If the output is a 0, you know that one of the outputs at least was 0, and maybe both of them were. So one, in the backwards thing, you have 3 cases for 1 configuration. In other words, and you can't take this output that's 1 and 0 and say for sure what were the inputs. In other words, if you have binary numbers that are all 1s and 0s, and the circuit, you want it to be reversible, it needs the same number of outputs as inputs because, you know, it's just common sense, you know. So that was, I guess, a big idea because, I don't know, no one else worried about it, but I did. One thing is all computers waste electricity. And why do they waste electricity? Because they get hot. They're like a radio. Okay, now if you buy a radio that plugs into the wall, you know, the radio may seem warm to you. And that's because the innards of the radio, especially in the old days of vacuum tubes, all had to dissipate a lot of heat. In fact, anything, an engine in a car, has a radiator. What's the radiator for? It's to remove the heat that's generated. And what's heat? Heat is waste power that's necessarily produced in an engine, okay? And there's no getting around it. There's a law of thermodynamics that demands that this heat be wasted, okay? And the same is true, and people who decided to try and do the physics of computation felt that computers had to dissipate energy, okay? And if computers could be reversible, what would be true is that they did not, there was no law that said a reversible computer has to dissipate heat. And so as a physics exercise, I was interested in reversibility because it seemed more natural to me to get rid of this necessity of generating heat. So in ordinary computers, you know, you have signals and the wires generate little heat and so on. So you're not going to make it all go away, but you could reduce the amount of heat generated in computers by building reversible ones. That was my goal. That's why I was interested in it. When it occurred to me to come up with something, I told Minsky and McCarthy, my 2 pals, about my ideas. And they sort of chuckled and they said, well, it's been proven by, and they mentioned a prestigious mathematician, that it's useless, okay? And they explained why they thought that, and they thought it was correct. I didn't believe it. And so I had to keep it to myself or they would not respect me, my intelligence, you know. So I had to believe the same lie they all believed for a while, or pretend to anyway. Meanwhile, I started to explore the possibilities of doing it, and I did pretty well with it. I had a lot of opposition because I was nobody. So I had to get to be somebody and to get them to listen to me. At some point, I had a company, and I worked for Bolt, Brannick, and Newman first. And I had a friend there at Digital. He designed their computer. His name was Ben Gurley. And he was my best friend, and we got along together. So both of us decided to leave our jobs and go into business together. And he would design computers and I would program them, and I would help him design them by, see, he was the master of the details, and I was the good person thinking of its overall structure or something like that. Ben left Digital Equipment Corporation and came to Information International, which was my company. Now, he had an obnoxious employee, and the obnoxious employee was so upset at Gurley's leaving, and so when Gurley left, the obnoxious guy was so upset that he was deserted by Gurley, who was his protector at Digital, that he came around and shot him, killed him. And that was probably the greatest tragedy of my life, too.
But
you know, but I continued on and did on my own, you know. So what I did was, at a time when it was unusual for a little company to go public, I did so. Actually, someone from the bank I dealt with suggested I meet with the guy, and who was a broker, and he wanted to take us public, and I agreed with him, and he took us public. It was a great accomplishment for me, made a fortune for me, and I was rich, and that lasted me till now. After my company went public and I was rich, Marvin Minsky suggested, why don't you come to MIT and be a professor? Which was very unusual because I hadn't graduated from college, and every faculty member had, okay? I'm going to tell you one anecdote. I taught a course called problem solving, okay? And at the end of a course, when you were a new professor, the students you had to tell the university whether it was a good subject or a bad subject, okay? So at the end of my semester teaching, I was called into the department head's office. His name was Louis Smullen, and he was an electrical engineer. He called me into his office, and he stares at me. And he keeps staring at me in a way that I thought was very peculiar. And, you know, I knew that they expected me to fall on my face because I was the first person who had no degree to be teaching at MIT, okay? So he's staring at me. And I said, "What are you staring at me for?" And he said, "Well, I suspect you hypnotized your students." And I said, "Hypnotize my students? Why do you think that?" You know, I thought that was a crazy thing. He says, "Because they like your course, and they shouldn't." And I said, "Why shouldn't they?" And he says, "Because you're nobody. You don't have a degree. You know, you hadn't gone to college yourself." My main mentor at MIT was Marvin Minsky, who supported me really against all odds, and also John McCarthy. But John McCarthy had moved to Stanford. And, you know, and when he died, Marvin Minsky was the closest worker to John McCarthy, and Marvin couldn't travel to give a talk at the ceremony, so he gave a speech that he wrote out, and I presented it, and I also gave my own talk. And I had a remarkable thing happen there. A woman came up to me and said, "Your problem-solving course at MIT changed my life." And I said, "Well, that's very remarkable, but when did you take it?" Because I didn't recognize. She said, "I didn't take it." And I said, "Well, what are you talking about?" And she said, and using an expression I still remember, but I'd never heard before, she said, my sweet mate took it, and we did the homework problems together." So her sweet mate was MIT when they started admitting women, put them in a building dedicated to women because they didn't want to mix them up in any man's facilities, and this was a male college. So they admitted a few women, and they put them in a building that had suites instead of rooms, and they put 4 students in each suite or something, and they called themselves suite mates. Okay, I didn't know any of this, and this all was news to me. So she said, so when she told me that it changed her life, and I said, "When did you take the course?" And she said, "I didn't take it," and she said, "My sweet mate took the course, and we did the homework problems together." I learned a lot from my students. One of the things I invented is the so-called Fredkin gate, okay, which is just a reversible gate. And I was keen on doing reversibility because it seemed to me that it was, if you have, there was a reason from physics why I was interested in reversibility. If computation can be reversible, it implies that the amount of energy needed to be dissipated by a circuit was 0. And that's important because there is no minimum energy needed for reversible circuitry. And this was why I was interested in reversibility. It's like a law of physics applied to signals inside computers. And if it's reversible, That means that no energy needs to be dissipated. Now, prior to my coming up with this idea, people would publish papers and they would prove that like a person I knew well wrote a paper where he proved that a gate had to dissipate a certain amount of energy. And I, on the other hand, thought that it didn't have to. Yeah, Landauer wrote a paper that's very famous where he computed exactly how much energy needed to be dissipated to forget a bit. And that was thought, since every circuit that most people used kept forgetting bits, it had to dissipate that much energy for every time it did it. And what I discovered is that I could make reversible circuitry, and the point of it was that it never needed to forget a bit. Okay? That meant that only reversible logic could build a computer that didn't need to dissipate any heat. And that meant you could build computers with billions of bits that didn't need any electricity to run. And they could run quite fast. And so, see, I never published anything. So I had to hire some people who would publish things. So I found this guy, Tommaso Toffoli. He had written a paper that showed how you could build a reversible computer by storing everything that an ordinary computer would have to forget. I had figured out how to have a reversible computer that didn't store anything because all the fundamental activity was reversible. Okay, so I decided to hire him because he was the only person who tried to do it, and he didn't succeed really, and I had, and I hired him to help me. And then Tom and I wrote these papers, and I used to organize meetings in the Caribbean. And I did this because I had an island in the Caribbean, and it had facilities for a lot of people, and so I would get people to come down. Okay, and I invited Wolfram to come down. Wolfram had done pioneering work in cellular automata. But everyone who invented cellular automata and who did it as like playing with a deck of cards. They did it by hand. They never thought of programming it on a computer and letting it run. Okay, Wolfram, who was interested in cellular automata, and he was a great guy, you know, and I wanted him to get on the bandwagon. I invited him to my meeting. He shows up at the meeting, and he had done all his work by hand, as had everyone else in cellular automata. And he didn't think of using a computer. And so when he, on his first visit to the island, I showed him a cellular automata running, and I had taken a display processor that I modified to be able to run a cellular automata with the stuff it used to put text up on the screen. I modified it so it would run a cellular automata. So I'm showing him a cellular automata running at 60 frames a second, continuously, like a movie. And he sees this thing, and he'd always done it just by hand. This was 10,000 times faster than doing it by hand, which is what he'd always done. So he'd never thought of using a computer to do cellular atomic. And he turns around and walks out. And he left the island and went back to someplace else. Okay, so when I went back to his meeting at Los Alamos, and I went back there, and I ran into him again, and he was now doing computer work, and I said to him, how come in all your work you don't have a reversible computer? And he says to me, oh, reversible ones are all trivial. And I went up, and this is the most telling thing about his intellect. He's a very smart guy. I showed him how he could change his rule slightly and make it reversible. And his eyes just about popped out of his head, and he knew I was correct, and he just went with it and ran with it, you know what I mean? And that was amazing to me, that he was that sharp to, you know, have staked his life sort of on its being irreversibly necessarily. And when I asked him that question, and his eyes popped open, you know, and it was interesting to me. I may have introduced him to this field, but what he has done is he is far better than I at getting other people involved. I've never bothered, and I don't have the talent that he has for that. What he did was he came up with similar ideas, and initially he didn't give me the credit I thought I deserved, but it became apparent to me that he did this independently, and he's better at writing things and better at hiring bright people who can do things than I ever was. As I look back on my career, I've had a fantastic life, and I'm not unhappy about any aspect of it, because I've had, you know, I've accomplished everything I might have done, and in spite of various handicaps, like not being a writer, okay? But I still have done a lot, and the world understands me, I think, and appreciates what I've done. And I want to thank the Sandia National Lab in Albuquerque, New Mexico, and all the people who come to these conferences and who participate in them, and they do research and publications and so on. And especially Michael V. Frank, who has been championing some of my works on reversible systems and others. Thank you, and if you have any questions, please ask them.